This graphic, I think, is what this month is all about. There is a wall between disabled people, whether they have autism, learning difficulty, mental health issues, physical, sensory impairments, and the rest of society. And that wall is what we're about in disability history, looking at the lessons of the past and how people have challenged it, where we are now and what we need to do in the future to get rid of that wall, because we have to have the same equality as everyone else in society, and there are lots of reasons why that doesn't happen. There are all sorts of strange ideas which you might think, well, it's all in the past, freak shows, people having to actually expose themselves to make money, like Thomas Inglefield, the artist, people coming along and laughing at people at Bedlam, paying a penny, pitying people and disabled people only able to live by begging, and I'm afraid we're back in that situation again. Court, kings and queens, dukes all over Europe having their pet disabled person there as the jester to make them laugh, to ease their things. Mimicking people, which of course our most recent president in the United States acquitted himself brilliantly at mimicking disabled people as part of his campaign. Frightening to children, think of Blind Pew in Treasure Island, a very frightening character, the way it's drawn. So disabled people are evil. Think of every horror movie you've ever seen and there's usually someone with a physical or mental impairment. Stephen King is a master of using disability to frighten people. Or even the stories we read to 3- and 4-year-olds, Hansel and Gretel. The witch is partially sighted, she's bent over, probably with osteoporosis, and she uses a stick. And she locks children up and then eats them. Now that's a really good message to put out about disabled women to young children. And then of course we have been the burden. Back 80 years ago in Nazi Germany, and through the last 10 years on a par, not quite killing us, except 130,000 of us have died. So where's the difference from actually setting up camps and doing it, or allowing people to die by withdrawing their benefits? There's not that huge gap, and there should be. In a civilised society, this should not be allowed to happen, and the British government is the only government in the world to have been criticised by the UN for its atrocious behaviour towards disabled people. And that's because we are a rich country, and we treat people like rubbish who are disabled. But despite all these pressures, throughout history there have been disabled people who have made it, if you call making it to be the king. Often it's because it was your bloodline. Richard III, of course, who of course was his impairments were bigged up by Shakespeare and Thomas More trying to acquit themselves well with the Tudors, who of course had deposed his family line. But it is from the body we found in the car park in Leicester, it appears that he did have scoliosis, but he could still wield a sword and he could go and fight. He didn't have the other impairments that Shakespeare gave him, the withered arm or the lame leg. They were dramatic effects that were given to please the Tudors. But that in itself tells you all about it. Of course, the film we had only last year, Queen Anne, she had 21 children and all of them died because she had immune deficiency disorder. She also had gout and several other conditions. Abraham Lincoln suffered from chronic depression all of his life. Roosevelt, post-polio, after he'd had it, he sort of struggled back. Although he had a deal with the press that, of course, they wouldn't show him as he really was. And if you go to the Library of Congress, there's only 3 out of 5,000 pictures of him which show him in his actual wheelchair. And it wasn't until Bill Clinton came to the White House that a statue was actually put up of him in a wheelchair. None was ever accepted in Washington until that time, 60 years after he died. So there is obviously a huge stigma there, but it's surprising that people still make it through. Take Lenin Moreno, who was vice president in Ecuador, shot, spinally injured, went on to do his political career as vice president and was elected as president. He's the only current president in the world who's a disabled person. Many people have assumed that Trump is, but let's not go down that road. Robert Martin, a self-advocate from New Zealand, who actually now sits on the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, an amazing achievement. Julius Caesar, well, what did he have? Well, he had epilepsy, but he was from a patrician family, so he wouldn't have got into this position otherwise. But so he also kept his fits quiet. William Cuffy, who for his efforts of collecting the charter for the working man, it wasn't women then, it was working man's vote, 3 million signatories, he was transported to Australia for his efforts. Winston Churchill, who is our greatest Briton, but was also a eugenicist and having depression. So he fits into disability in a number of different ways, having argued for our compulsory sterilisation and death. When he was Home Secretary, Parliament didn't accept that, but instead we got the Mental Deficiency Act as a direct result of that, and a whole 3 generations of people with learning disability were locked away. So yes, he was a great politician in the sense that he won the Second World War largely. All the people who fought did, really. But anyway, and then we have people like David Blunkett, a well-known Labour politician. So now what I'm saying is, you look at this and you can find in the general course of politics, there are disabled people who come to the fore. There's another group who perhaps we could call the revolutionaries, who didn't get elected, but played a huge role in shaping human rights. People like Harriet Tubman in the slave rebellions that she fomented, and the Underground Railway. Rosa Luxemburg, a great revolutionary in Germany, who had a dislocated hip the whole of her life. Helen Keller, always seen for her brilliance at becoming a deaf, blind person, but she was a revolutionary socialist, and she believed that capitalism needed to be swept away so that all people in the world could have equality. And she was a founder member of the American Communist Party. Now, you don't hear that in the stuff that is actually put out about Helen Keller. Or Antonio Gramsci, who you do hear about, who was put in prison by Mussolini. It was said a man with this brain is too dangerous to be allowed out. He was subject to 20 years in prison. But he then wrote his prison notebooks, which are still used as a political text in many parts of the world. And of course, Che Guevara, who did become the Minister of Economics in Cuba, but when he went on to foment revolution elsewhere, was executed, but partly because of his chronic asthma that he was undergoing. Wondered why he smoked a cigar, I'm not sure, but he did have chronic asthma. Now, what do we find about people who, this paradox between the oppression, the stereotype, and yet people making it? Well, a lot of people pass as disabled, they have hidden impairments and they don't necessarily put them forward. There are personal and political struggles that people are involved in. In fact, there's an old medieval German proverb, and we don't use this word in red, cripple, very much, it's not a good word. But the phrase was, the cripple always leads the dance. And to some extent, some disabled people, because of their personal struggles, do come forward as leaders. And there's no doubt that that actually happens. And this happened before the disability movement as such, with the bloodline, the social position, and then a determination, as this group had, that there needed to be social justice, not just for themselves, but for the wider society. So we have that, but then about 115 years ago, we got the first organised disabled people's rights organisation in the country. It goes back a lot longer than most people would have said. So, for instance, sign language, which was invented in a way that could be transposed to a written language by the Abbé Lepay in Paris in 1771, led to a renaissance of deaf culture. Even Queen Victoria was a signer. There were many deaf schools with signing teachers, and a thriving culture with many professionals who'd come through who were using sign language. This was seen as a threat by the growing bands of eugenicists across Europe, who said this group will outbreed us hearing people, and therefore we must stop them using sign language. And a conference held in Milan, everywhere except from the United States, banned sign language. It was only because the Gallaudet brothers had fought hard for setting up their own system of American Sign Language, and so it was retained there. Everywhere else, deaf children were not allowed to learn sign at school. Deaf Mute, the magazine of the community, as it was called then, encouraged people to unite in the defence of their own interests after this. And so it was that the British Deaf and Dumb Association, which later became the British Deaf Association, was founded in Leeds in July 1890. And the British Deaf Association fights for the cultural model of deafness and the recognition of BSL as an official language even today. Secondly, blind people organised themselves, the National League of the Blind, it should be 1894, error there, argued for an entitlement to direct state aid and the abolition of charities. They were very much against the charities. They joined the TUC and the Labour Party as a union. The conditions in the charity workshops were notorious for their excessively low wages. Often, blind workers there had to be out begging to make ends meet to keep their families or take in a second job. They were a very militant group, and they had many hundreds of strikes, and in 1912 there was a strike that lasted for 6 months. They organised marches on London in 1920 and 1933, coming from all parts of the country, under the slogan, "Justice, not charity." And they did in fact get the Blind Persons Act. It didn't have in it most of what they wanted, and Ben Perce, who'd argued for a minimum wage, it had to be years later that the Labour Party actually brought that in. But he'd argued for it back then 100 years before. So another group with a particular interest of driving around, and why shouldn't disabled people drive around, was formed by 6 ex-servicemen from the First World War who met at Roehampton. They'd all lost limbs, but they didn't see why they couldn't have adapted cars and drive. They formed the Disabled Drivers Motor Club. A guy called O.A. Denley was given a trike, which is the thing you can see there with the tarpaulin over his legs, and on this he crossed the Alps to demonstrate what a rather lousy machine it was, and out of this formed the Invalid Trike Association in 1948. These two came together, and actually the million-plus people with Motability cars owe it directly to this group of people who actually went in and negotiated with the government and said, "We're fed up with driving around these little blue cars that you can't carry anyone else in. We want to have the same car as anyone else," and that's how the Motability Kit scheme. Unfortunately, governments haven't controlled it. The chief executive for the Motability scheme paid himself a salary of 1.7 million and took 2.3 million of disabled people's money when he left. That lack of control by government is outrageous and should not have happened. Nevertheless, it was set up by disabled people. The Disabled Women Income Group that Judy mentioned was an important pressure group set up by 2 women who were not given any sort of benefit because they weren't injured at work or in the war, they just had a disability. So they weren't given any benefit, and they fought for and won the attendance allowance, and then went on to create the space which actually led to the Chronically Sick and Disabled People's Act, which is probably still the strongest piece of legislation that we had, stronger than the DDA, but of course it was run a coach and horses through by the Gloucester judgment, which the Labour Party, when it was in power over the previous 12 years, did not reverse, which meant that local authorities had to pay for the full cost of what a disabled person needed. That was what the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act said, and by the judgment that moved it out of the way was never restored, and we have deteriorated in our living standards since then. We also had the struggle for independent living, which was something that developed alongside of this, perhaps starting with Ed Roberts, who's known as the father of disability living, who set up the Berkeley Independent Living Centre in the 1960s. They had an occupation in San Francisco for 28 days to force Nixon to bring in laws that meant that all disabled people could actually get their money so they could live independently. Here in the UK, we already had Maggie Davis mentioned. Ken and Maggie, newly married, both disabled people, wanted to live in their own home, and there you can see on one side the one that they got designed by an architect, of course, from Scandinavia, because there were no such architects in England that could design an accessible home. Another person who was really important in this struggle was John Evans, who was the first person to have direct payments from Hampshire County Council. He set up the European Independent Living Network and is still campaigning across Europe for independent living. And what that means is Article 19 of the UN CRPD, it's the law in every country which has signed that, 178 countries, and yet ignored. We have the right to live in the community with our own home, with whatever assistance we need. That is a fundamental human right, and it is ignored by many governments, particularly ours, when they shut down the Independent Living Fund, which gave people the extra money that they actually needed. And despite the fantastic battle by DIPAC, Disabled People Against the Cuts, we lost that battle in 2015. Alright. So I'll speed on a bit. Paul Hutt was mentioned, and I think Mike Oliver too. And I think the legacy we have from those thinkers, and the book Stigma, and then going on to your Pius, and then BCODP, and it was Mike Oliver who called it the social model of disability. He said himself, he didn't invent it, but it was this transition from seeing the problem in the person to seeing, seeing the problem in society that led to whole new generations of people coming into action with the British Council of Disabled People, which James spoke about so well. And we also had at the same time another network that set up, the Disabled People's Liberation Network, which came more from the women's movement and a more empathetic approach, and produced a magazine in from Nicole Michelin, who's here tonight, was one of the leading members of that. And that led on to that approach of a much broader front of politics in the Alliance for Inclusive Education, including parents, young people and disabled people together. And a good example of that was one of the spurs off the Alliance was the Young and Powerful, here in a picture, occupying Nottinghamshire County Council and forcing one of their members to be given the right to go to a mainstream school, which she succeeded in, to then go on and get her degree, having previously been deemed as ineducable. Where now then for disabled people? This is the last slide. Well, the last 10 years have been horrendous. Cuts in livelihood, universal credit, benefit reform, all the bedroom tax and so on have really led to very serious impacts on our lives. Cuts need to be reversed. Disabled people generally have been 9 times harder hit than any other group by this, and those with severe impairments 19 times harder than any other group in our society. No wonder 130,000 have died. Hate crime has been fueled by ministerially encouraged press saying that everybody out there is a scrounger, programs like Benefit Street and all the rest of it, the Sun running a hotline to find how many scroungers you can find, and this has led to a huge increase in hate crime on our streets against disabled people. Housing, we still, despite having laws about it, only 7% of our housing stock is accessible to people with ambulance impairment, and I won't go on about education. That person to my left has already said it, but it has been a really backward move. We now have a third more children in segregated education than we did under the last government. And that's when they've signed a declaration saying they support inclusion. So what do we need? Well, out of this election, whichever party you go for, we need to have the funding for DPOs and our core costs so we can have a real voice in the community. All of that has been cut. We need restoration and improvement of benefits. We need independent living properly, and we need a national independent living service. We need inclusive education, and not just paying lip service to it, but a complete restructure of our education system with inclusion as a central principle, not competition. We need full accessible environments and transport, and we still haven't got it in many parts of the country. All new housing to build to lifetime standards, and discrimination to be challenged, not by us individuals, but let's have a state agency that challenges discrimination, like the Health and Safety at Work agency, which challenges employers who actually break the law. Why should it be left to the individual who's discriminated against to challenge discrimination?